In today's Locked On Pelicans, reports say Herb Jones is going to be the Pelicans starting center. And I'll tell you why that's a good thing, but it is also misleading. And we've got some roster updates as well. It's the Friday episode of Locked On Pelicans. Let's go.
You are Locked On Pelicans, your daily New Orleans Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Welcome to another edition of Locked On Pelicans, the daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Pelicans and NBA, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, available wherever you get your podcasts and available on YouTube. I'm your host, Pelicans Insider, credential member of the media, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. Here with y'all on this Friday. No game day for the Pelicans as their game against the Orlando Magic was canceled. Totally fine thing. If you want to know more about that, we talked about it in yesterday's episode of Locked On Pelicans. But today, we're getting into the starting lineup here. Shams Charania, now of ESPN, reports that Herb Jones is essentially going to be the center. That is a good thing because it means a small ball lineup. But I'm going to tell you why that's also misleading, because it's going to kind of be more center by committee than you realize. And it has to do with the Pelicans' defensive scheme. And I'll explain in today's episode. And of course, thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast covering everything you want to know about this team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. And of course, become an everydayer of Locked On Pelicans. Make us your first listen. Everydayers listen Monday through Friday. A lot of what we've been talking about has come to fruition. So you want to know what's going on with the team, you can come right here. So let's get into the report of Shams Charania talking on the Pat McAfee show on ESPN about the Pelicans starting lineup. And he said, Zion looks good. We don't need to get into that because we've been talking about that a lot. Zion looks real good and the rest of the league better watch out. But the bigger thing was, who's going to start on opening night? They started Daniel Theis in the first preseason game, but they didn't really use him like a traditional center. They did at times. And we wanted a small ball lineup in the first place. We'll get into kind of what small ball is or what it means for this team at the very least. So small ball, who plays center? And we got our answer. Shams says it's going to be Herb Jones at the center for the New Orleans Pelicans. My initial reaction to this is great. That's what we've wanted to see. All I want this team to do to start the season is put your best 5 guys out there on the court and figure out if it works or make it work. And so in this case, if Trey Murphy is injured, it's going to be Dejounte Murray, CJ McCollum, Brandon Ingram, Zion Williamson, and now Herb Jones. I love this. Put your best players out there on the court and make opponents figure out how to defend you. Set the tone. Be proactive rather than reactive, which is normally how the Pelicans go about it, being reactive. But here, they have an opportunity just to do something different. And to me, we talked about it in yesterday's episode about growth from head coach Willie Green. This shows it. He's going against very conventional thinking. You hear a lot of media talking heads, even Pelicans fans, and maybe you think this way, and that's okay. That they need a center. Look at the teams in their division. Look at the teams in the West. The league is getting a little bit bigger. They need to play a center. I'm not sure that they do. They might. This could be a disaster, but at least we're going to get to find out and we'll get some real answers to all of this. So put your best 5 guys out there on the court and just make it work. No disrespect towards Daniel Theis here, but as I've said, and other people around the league have said it too, you could argue he's the worst starting center in the league if he starts on opening night. If you're going to do that for a guy that was almost out of the NBA, what's the point? Put in a guy that has something that can help you. And I do worry at times that the Pelicans could be playing 4-on-5 offensively with Daniel Theis, though they started to figure out how to use him, I thought, in that game against the Orlando Magic. And if it doesn't work, rebounding's a concern. There's another bigger concern, by the way, that I don't think people are talking about enough that we'll look at in the next segment here. If it doesn't work, you can adjust later and start Daniel Theis. Now, the Pelicans keep saying, one of the things with Herb Jones being the center here, and this is what gets into the other big point I want to make here. Herb Jones being their starting center is misleading. Very misleading, and I'll explain why. The Pelicans keep saying Zion is not at a 5. He's not a center. They've repeatedly said that. Willie Green, after practice the other day, even said, we need to take that out of our vocabulary. Okay, fair enough. But they are playing a small ball lineup here, so what does that mean? Small ball essentially means, one, you're going small. But small ball is not about what you do offensively. It's about defensively and who guards the opposing center. That's the question. It's never been, is Zion a 5 offensively? No one cares when it comes to small ball about your offense. It's who guards the opposing center. That's what makes a small ball lineup work or not work, a la the Warriors' death lineup here. So small ball is more about who defends opposing centers. It's not only going to be Herb Jones, and that's why this is misleading. They might have him initially on the center as the defensive assignment, but the way the Pelicans play defense is they don't just like stick to your man and then you just stick on him the rest of the time. When it comes to defense, the main thing you look at is how do you defend the pick and roll? And there's a number of different ways to do it. When that screen is set, you can fight through the screens. You can go above the screen, below the screen. You can hedge and recover. Hedge and recover is you kind of throw 2 guys at the ball and quickly get back to the big man who's likely rolling to the basket. There's a number of different ways to defend the pick and roll. The Pelicans use one called switching. They don't have guys that do a good job of fighting through screens. So when a screen gets set, rather than trying to kind of fight through that and stick with your original man, so guard on guard, big man on big man, they just switch. And your big man switches onto the guard, and then your guard switches onto the big man, and then you try and switch them back later. That's what they do. They run a switching scheme. What a switching scheme does a pretty good job of is stopping guys from getting into the paint. That guard can't really like roll, come off of that screen and then drive and attack the basket. Roll's the wrong word there. They can't drive and attack the basket because someone is immediately on them. It might be a big man, and that's why the Pelicans have searched for a big man that can defend on the perimeter. That was the big issue with Jonas Valanciunas. When he switched, he would get cooked. Couldn't do it. Daniel Tice might be able to. Maybe Yves Missi does. But when we've looked at center options, it's for a guy that can defend on the perimeter, and that basically means on switches when they're switched onto a guard. So, yes, Herb might start guarding the opposing center, but as actions are happening and offense is being run for the opponent, they're all going to switch. And you would imagine that the opponent is going to try and involve Zion Williamson in these actions, in the pick and roll, so that they want Zion, who's maybe on a wing or a guard, is going to come set up, on that screen, is going to switch on to the big man, and that's something that they feel they want for the opponent. So it's not that just Herb Jones is going to be glued to these centers. It's still going to be everybody kind of pitching in. Now, you just try and let guys not get into the paint or prevent guys from getting into the paint, and that is the Pelicans' defense, and it's worked the past couple of years. So when people are like, oh, my God, there's no traditional center, you don't really have center-on-center action all the time here. That sounds dirty. You don't really have center-on-center action all the time with the Pelicans. And look, if teams want to slow things down, and this is what it would need, say you're playing the Memphis Grizzlies, Zach Edey, Herb Jones on a 7'2" guy, or however tall Edey is. Look, if they want to run their entire offense through Zach Edey and forego John Morant and all of those things, I'm fine with that. This is why I didn't want the Pelicans running their offense through Jonas Valanciunas in the playoffs in that first-round series against the Oklahoma City Thunder. It would have slowed things down and it wouldn't have worked, and you would have played even more into the hands of OKC. Let Zach Edey score 40 points, and no one else is going to do anything on that Grizzlies team because he's using up all the possessions, and they're slower. When they go to play that 2-game set when you look at their opening games, I'm really not worried about the center situation for the Chicago Bulls, like killing New Orleans and them still winning the game. Let them. They're not going to be posting up Vucevic all the time. You go then on the road to Golden State. Okay, what center do they have there? And then you go to Portland. Sure, let DeAndre Ayton score 35 in those 2 games, and you're not going to see anyone else do anything. And I think the Pelicans can still win those games. So centers are going to get paid off their performances against New Orleans, but hopefully they're going to be doing it in losses. And I think that that's really what might happen. And that's why, try this. And look, Zion's still going to defend 5s a ton. You're going to see Ingram on them a little bit too. Herb's going to be doing it. I'm not overly concerned. And when I hear this, it's like, okay, they're going to be switching a bunch. That's what they do. That's what they've done in years past. So it's just kind of business as usual. They're just going to do it a little bit smaller. Might not work, though. Look, there's definite concerns. Let's look at those small ball struggles. And I have one that involves Herb Jones, 2 that involve Herb Jones that you might not even have thought about yet that I think are really important to discuss. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by my go-to ticketing app, Game Time. I love going to live events, whether it is basketball games, whether it's just theater, comedy. I like getting out of the house and doing things. It makes the weekend more fun. Game Time is my go-to app for everything. And Game Time has a new feature, which I love, called Game Time Picks. And it makes getting the tickets for your favorite live events even easier. Game Time Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. So whatever it is you're looking for, or maybe you're just bored on a Friday night, you want to go out and do something, get on the Game Time app, see what's going on in your city, New Orleans or elsewhere, and you're probably going to get a deal on something awesome Friday night all of a sudden. They have all-in pricing. If you toggle that up front, it means no hidden fees, anything like that. If you're going to a venue you haven't been before, you can get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game Time. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. And now for your second listen, Locked On NBA. We're there every day. I was just on there the other day. We're breaking down the biggest stories around the association. We were looking at the GM survey and what it tells us. That was a really fun one. Go give Locked On NBA a listen. We'll be recapping every single game. So if you didn't watch all the games, don't worry about it. We got you covered on the Locked On NBA podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So let's keep talking about small ball here for the New Orleans Pelicans. And look, it's a bit of a risk. I think it'll work. I just like that they are putting their best five healthy. More on that in a minute when we talk Trey Murphy, CJ McCollum in the next segment. You're putting your best five healthy guys out there on the court. I like that. I support that. That's what I want to see. That's only going to be a good thing for this team. But there are some concerns about a small ball lineup. There's a variety of them. You might be thinking rebounding. We'll get into that in a second here. But there's two that involve Herb Jones that I don't know if people are looking at enough. So let's dive into those right now because these could really impact and have a significant impact on the Pelicans' win-loss record this season. Herb Jones is best as a perimeter defender. On wings, on guards, shutting down the opponent's best offensive player that's like not a big man usually. You've heard Paul George be like, Herb Jones is the best defender in the NBA. You've heard Luka Doncic be like, yeah, that dude is the best at guarding me. Herb shut him down in a game in the Smoothie King Center last season. I talked to Nick Angstead, host of Locked On Mavs, after that. He said that might be the worst game Luka Doncic has ever played in his career, and it was because of what Herb Jones did. Herb is best as a perimeter defender on wings and guards. Using him on a center seems a little bit like a waste of his talent to me. Now, Dejounte Murray coming in and hopefully being an elite perimeter defender again, he definitely dropped off in Atlanta and seemed like he was part of the problem there, but that also just could be Atlanta. So maybe having Dejounte Murray and them seeing his defense and his work ethic and all of that in practice makes this a little bit easier to kind of lose what Herb does best on the perimeter, locking guys up. But in the preseason game, you saw how much fun it was to see those two in the backcourt wrecking havoc. I don't know if I love losing that as much. Now, it goes back to what we just said in the last segment here. He's going to be switching. He's not only going to be on big men the whole time. And so there's also that part of it. So I think that mitigates some of it too. But the strength of this team is still going to be defense, and then offensively just Zion being Zion, I think. You don't want to lose some of that. So is my initial question to this is, does that minimize the impact that Herb Jones can make? We know he can defend bigger. We know he can do that. He'll happily take on those assignments. You won't hear him complain. I talked to him at Media Day about it. That interview is up on the Locked On Pelicans YouTube page, by the way, one-on-one with Herb Jones. So he'll do it. He'll do it great. But is it better to put him on staff? Is it better to put him on other players? We'll find out. If this doesn't work, you can start Daniel Theis. And I thought the early small sample size in a preseason game returns with Daniel Theis were not bad. So I feel okay with that if you need to go to that later. But I like that they're starting with all of this. The other concern that I have when it comes to Herb Jones guarding a bigger player is foul trouble. We saw he did not get a kind whistle from the refs at all last year. At all last year. Does him, playing up a position, someone who's stronger, bigger than him, does that cause more fouls? Or is he going to get the benefit of the doubt from the refs? I'm not entirely sure. If he's out there and he just racks up fouls early, well, then you don't even get him to do anything you want him to do. And that's certainly not an ideal situation for the New Orleans Pelicans. So that is also my concern, is the beating that he's going to take with that, the fouls that he might give up. Does that keep him off the court? In theory, he's one of the better three-point shooters on this team. You want him out there. You want him on the court because he is a very impactful player for this franchise. So those are my two concerns when it comes to Herb Jones. The other one is the rebounding. Now, they did a good job against the Orlando Magic, a very big team. Preseason, really only looking at a half of that. So I don't know how much we want to read into that necessarily, but at least I feel rebounding will be okay. And it might come down to what the final starting lineup is going to be. Maybe not the one on opening night because Trey Murphy's hurt. We'll dive into more of that later. But this is something that the Pelicans are going to need to do, and it's going to be a bit of a challenge. They want to play fast. We talked about pace in yesterday's show. They need to get up and down the court. They got to take quick shots. But you also play with pace by running in transition. You can't really run in transition if you're all going for a defensive rebound. Ideally, you have someone that just, inhales, vacuums up defensive boards, and then you can have four guys just sprinting down the court, trying to play in transition and putting, that type of pressure on your opponent. But if you have 3, 4, 5 guys going for defensive boards because you need to secure them because you lack the height, the size there, though they do have a lot of length, more on that in a sec here, then that kind of prevents some of that. So usually if you're a very elite rebounding team on the defensive side of the ball, you play a little bit slower. That's not what the Pelicans want. These two things are conflicting. It's not like they're at odds with one another, but there's a little bit, I think, of a conflict right there. So that's partially a concern. You can gang rebound. I think that's probably what they will try and do. Team rebound. That was a hallmark of them under early Monty Williams teams. So they can definitely do that. And I think you'll see them go with that. Does it impact the offense? Or are they going to be okay? TBD on that one. These are big questions we have for the start of the season. They do have length, though, and I think that's worth keeping in mind. When you look at wingspans, right? Like, who cares where a player's height is? If you've got long arms, you can go and get those boards. Now, they're kind of a little bit tied together there. But the Pelicans really made sure to hammer that point home on media day. There's a lot of length on this team. Dejounte Murray has really good length. Zion has pretty good length. Herb Jones has insane length. Brandon Ingram, is basically feels like a 7-footer, even though he's not, but his wingspan is massive. They can all rebound. That's a lot of arms that go a long way. So that is a way that you can kind of not worry about it as much. Look at wingspans versus just height. Ideally, you get both, certainly. But those are ways that I think they look at this and they don't feel worried about this sort of thing. I think they know there are potential concerns there, but overall they feel pretty good about this team and what they're going to be capable of doing. And maybe we'll learn a little bit more on Sunday. And it seems like right now that game against the Miami Heat is going to be happening in Miami right now. So TBD on that one, though. We'll find out for sure, but it seems like it's going ahead as of right now. So that means they'll get some of those reps in. We'll maybe see, the starting lineup that we want to try and see, even though Ingram's not going to be playing in that. Should you be concerned about that or not? That's in yesterday's show, by the way. This is why you got to become an everydayer. You know what's going on around the team. But my big concern about Herb at the 5, and I put that in quotes, right? Because not everyone's playing the 5, but he's going to play the 5. Zion's going to play the 5. They're going to be switching. You'd also do something called pre-switching, by the way. You'll see players do that when they know a pick and roll is coming. Have 2 guys switch already so you end up with the right matchup that you want. So there's ways that you can kind of mitigate some of that. But I do worry about the foul trouble on Herb Jones and just not using him to his full potential. But overall, given the way they kind of run things, you'll still see Herb Jones switched onto guards, onto wings, plenty. And I think that'll be a good thing for this team too. And Zion has proven to be a good one-on-one defender, and I like that about him. And he also knows when to be a really good help defender, and that's where he's elite. Same with Herb Jones too. I think they'll be able to kind of still be themselves, even if Herb is starting at the 5, defending the 5, since that's really just what it is with everything here. But this kind of gives us an idea of what the opening night starting lineup is going to be. Dejounte Murray, CJ McCollum, Brandon Ingram, Zion Williamson, Herb Jones. Is that the best? Is CJ starting over Trey? Should Trey be starting? There's an injury at play into this. Plus Matt Ryan waived. I want to get into that too. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So NFL fans, NBA fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. And you're going to get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. You can do it for the Pelicans right now. Look, maybe you're feeling good about Spencer Rattler. Maybe you're not feeling good about Spencer Rattler and the Saints taking on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. But if you're feeling good about the Pelicans, -6.5 over the Chicago Bulls on opening night. $5 bet down on that right now. You're getting $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. And all you have to do, go to FanDuel.com, America's #1 sportsbook, to get started. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. And now for your second listen, Locked On Saints, with Spencer Rattler starting. I'm excited. Look, we don't want injuries to happen, but is he going to be good? Is he not? Is he the future? What's the playbook going to look like? What's the offense going to be? How are they going to help him out? Ross Jackson, host of the Locked On Saints podcast, is going to make sense of it all for you. Everything black and gold you need right there over at the Locked On Saints podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So now that we know Herb is the 5, we essentially know the opening night starting lineup. And it's going to be Dejounte Murray, CJ McCollum, Brandon Ingram, Zion Williamson, and Herb Jones. No, I'll get into the Matt Ryan thing in a minute, but I don't think this has anything to do with the trade going on here. Those 5 are going to be this opening night starting lineup. And here's my question about that. Is that lineup starting because Trey's out injured, and Trey will not be ready for opening night? He said that on the Pelicans podcast recently. Or on Pelicans.com recently. He's not ready on opening night. Would he have been the starter on opening night? When you're playing that small ball lineup, you could use his length. He knows he needs to rebound. His rebounding improved as the season went on. I'd like to see him in the starting lineup over CJ McCollum. Are they starting CJ just because Trey Murphy is out injured, or because he's CJ McCollum and they want him in there? His shooting is important. He changed his shot profile. He was awesome last year. He was. But Trey and the size and kind of being that guy that is going to be a key player for you years down the line seems like someone that needs to be starting. And Trey wants to start. He wants to be starting. At Media Day, he also said, I am a starter in the league on this team or elsewhere. They will get an extension done. I expect we'll see that sometime in the next 2 weeks, less than that. But he needs to be starting at some point. When you look at Zion Williamson and his net rating with just one other player, it was highest with Trey Murphy. When Zion and Trey were on the court, good things happened for this team. Simple as that. Now, Zion didn't have a bad net rating with CJ either, but Trey just feels more impactful. When he takes a ton of threes, this team tends to do better because they need that kind of shooting. Same for CJ too. But you need that size. CJ is not a great defender. I don't think Trey's an elite defender or even good, but he's got a higher ceiling to be a better defender than CJ McCollum does. He should be starting. It's really as simple as that. Are they starting CJ because he's CJ McCollum? He gets paid a lot of money and you want to do right by his ego? Or are you doing this just because Trey Murphy is out injured? That's my big question right now, and we don't have an answer to that. Now, we don't need to worry about this for a minute either, because Trey, if he's not ready on opening night, is still going to need to get kind of into conditioning. He'll probably be on a bit of a minutes restriction when he comes back from the injury. So it's probably a moot point right now. But I'm curious about that. When he's ready, will he be starting or not? Now, if this team's winning games, you're not going to mess with the success that they're having. But long term, I do think they do need to start Trey Murphy. So we'll see when it comes down to that. I think your starting lineup of Dejounte Murray, Trey, Ingram, Zion, Herb is the best starting lineup that they can put out there. We'll find out if that ends up happening or not. That's also partially why I said, like, one big, you want a hot take here is that, yeah, I do think that they could end up trading CJ McCollum because that's a lot to pay a bench guy, even if I do think he'd be really good off of the bench. So the other big news here, the Pelicans waived 2 players. Adonis Arms was waived, made sense. The bigger one was Matt Ryan, but this shouldn't come as a shock to you. He was on an unguaranteed deal, a training camp deal, essentially, that if he made it, they would pay him or not. But unguaranteed meant that they could cut him. He just doesn't appear to be in the rotation. And this frees up a roster spot for the Pelicans for an unbalanced trade later. I do not think this is a precursor of any sort of trade or anything like that with Ingram or elsewhere. I just simply think they realized they weren't going to play him. They're already over into the luxury tax even before his contract, so waive him, save some money that way. I don't hate waiving the 15th man on your roster to save money against the luxury tax. I would like them to pay it, but I don't hate this sort of move doing it. Choose your spot to do that, definitely. And I think it also gives Matt Ryan a little bit of a chance to latch on to another team. I would imagine he'll get picked up maybe by the Pistons or elsewhere pretty quickly when it comes to all of that. So they're doing right by the player too, being like, hey, maybe go sign with another team, maybe get some preseason run and find a roster spot before these things get set in the next week or two. So it's saving them money and doing right by them. But I do not think that I would not read into this as it's like, oh, something's coming. They have an open roster spot now. I think they'll just leave that roster spot open, just not pay anyone, and then try and kind of figure out what they need to figure out as the season goes on. But if Matt Ryan wasn't going to play, I mean, and he wasn't, you don't need to, they're paying him now. So it's not like, well, it doesn't matter. You could have done this during the season or later. Yeah. But you're paying him a per diem. You're paying him a salary right now too. This just gets that money off the books right now. And more importantly, I do think it gives him a chance to go latch on with another team elsewhere. So preseason game Sunday, we think. Haven't heard anything otherwise. I'll be watching that. We'll recap it on Monday, tell you what we learned here on the Locked On Pelicans podcast as we gear up for the regular season. We'll have some other things coming for you next week as well. It's going to be a lot of fun. As always, I'm your host, Jake Madison, at NolaJake on Twitter. And I'll be back with y'all on Monday. Enjoy the weekend. Enjoy the game. This is the Locked On Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.